A lot of people think that they can use an SBIR or a SIBR to bridge to the next round of VC funding, and they can't do that because by the end of that SBIR, you likely won't have the traction you need to get to your next round of VC funding, and certainly not your next round of government funding. And so it ends up not being a bridge, but it ends up being a pier where you just are going to run off the end.
This is Undelayed, the show about the amazing founders and companies who've used government R&D grants, contracts, and sales to build their products, grow their companies, and keep their equity. We're Katie Person and Gene Kesselman from MIT and Jeff Orson from FedScout. And on today's show, how a SEAL's frustration on deployment plus SBIRs led to a new way to communicate on the battlefield.
I grew up in the Northeast, graduated from high school in 2003, and had always wanted to be a Navy SEAL. So went right into the Navy, right to SEAL training, went through BUDS, Class 252, and spent the majority of my 8-year career as a SEAL operational out of the East Coast, out of SEAL Team 4. And during that time, I did 4 deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, mostly operating in urban environments, doing counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. And this is between 2003 and 2011. And on my first deployment in particular, I had an experience which was pretty impactful for me. I don't want to give too many in-depth details, but I'll set the stage for it. We were going out on an operation in Baghdad. This is 2006, and it was pretty chaotic over there. It was like the Wild West in some of these areas. And we were going into a neighborhood looking for a high-ranking Al-Qaeda operative. Big army, conventional army had just been shot out of there like a week earlier. So we knew it was sort of a bad neighborhood, pretty hostile to American forces. We're going out at 2:00 in the morning looking for, like I said, this senior operative. And right before we roll out, I'm the lead turret gunner. So I'm on the number 1 Humvee, and I'm behind a big 50 cal machine gun. And my job during the operation will be to keep everybody out of the north, right? So I'm on the perimeter, and I'm to keep everybody from coming in from the north as the operation is taking place behind me. And right before we roll out, Intel pulls me into the operations center called the Joint Operations Center, or the JOC. And they've got a drone flying above the target area. And they say, hey, look, we've got 3 or 4 armed, guys patrolling in your sector. So just be aware, you might encounter them while you're out there. And that plus the context of going into this neighborhood, we were expecting to get some contact when we went in there. And effectively, I made what was a sound tactical decision at the time, and ended up being the wrong decision when the dust settled and we learned more. And as a result, a few people lost their lives that shouldn't have. And that was pretty impactful for me. And really what it came down to was a kind of a failure of intelligence and a failure of communication. There were some folks in that area that we were unaware of. And even if our operations center was aware of their presence, they wouldn't have been able to communicate that effectively to me, just given the challenges with communications on the battlefield and the bottlenecks and how information flows from the ops center out into the field.
For the people who are listening who haven't had experiences downrange, can you describe what the actual process is to communicate?
Sure. So I'll start from my position behind that turret. At the time, I had 1 radio in my kit, and so I'm hearing conversations on 1 radio channel. There's probably 3 or 4 channels with that particular radio going on at any one point during that operation. So I was on the mobility, or the kind of perimeter freak, if you will, frequency. There was an assault frequency, there was a command and control frequency, and there was a fires frequency, which is what we use to talk to the aircraft. Then there was another radio called the SATCOM radio, which is satellite communications back to the operations center. That's a totally separate radio. And unless you have that radio, you're not hearing any of that traffic. And, so if you're on the Intel team and you're back in the operations center and you discover some piece of intelligence that you need to relay forward, you generally have to get on the satellite radio, call that into the communicator who's there on the ground, who has that SATCOM radio. He's got to get it on the SATCOM radio. He's got to then pick up his assault radio, his tactical radio, and he could be on one of 4 nets at any one time. And he's got to telephone that message to anybody that might be relevant. And sometimes he sends it out to all the different frequencies, and it's fine because there's a lull in the operation. Sometimes there's so much traffic going on at any one point that he can never really effectively relay that without stepping on something that's, imminently important. And so at every stage, you've got these sort of bottlenecks where you've got to play telephone to relay things from one freak to the other. If you don't relay it effectively, or it gets stepped on, meaning somebody else cues up the mic while you're speaking and it cuts you off, that what could be a critical piece of intelligence won't make it to half the team. And that I have friends that have, had blue on blues because they didn't get a particular radio call. It just, these challenges impact people in ways that don't get talked about and don't get written about, but they are relevant in every single operation I've ever been on. Later in my career, when I held leadership positions, I had two radios on, monitoring two different frequencies at any one point. And so I had one person talking in each ear at the same time, and throwing a firefight in the middle of that. And all of a sudden, I'm super stressed out. I'm not able to process information at all coming in audibly, let alone one person talking in each ear. And so when things get dangerous and the shooting starts, that's when you need to be able to communicate the most effectively. And that's effectively when it just shuts down, because there's so much stress involved. Most people don't know this, but when you're super stressed out, your sense of hearing is the second sense that you lose, and you lose it very quickly. So, about 40% of your brain is allocated towards processing information visually. And I think it's only about 4 to 5% is towards processing information audibly. And so, you can imagine that when everything comes over the radio and you get stressed out, your ability to actually detect that and perceive it drops pretty quickly. So like I said, it's a challenge that every warfighter has experienced on the battlefield. And what nobody talks about is that's in the tactical environment, but in an office, in the operations center, in air traffic control, they're doing the same thing, either over the radio forward to guys in the field, or between each other, they're just over the telephone. And so some of the most time-sensitive, strategic, critical information that gets passed through the DoD gets passed over like Cisco landlines, which in and of itself is a big problem.
So you said you did 8 years with the teams. And then, so at the end of those 8 years, where were you? Did you had a need, you had identified this need. Did you also have an idea for a solution, or were you thinking about making this your career? Can you walk us through that thought process?
Sure. So at the end of my 8 years, I was 26 years old. It was 2011. I decided to get out, and I knew 100% that I wanted to build some technology to bring back into the military, not just to help soft guys, special operations forces, SEALs and whatnot, but to help anybody that was on the battlefield and putting their life on the line. But at the time when I was getting out, I had gone into the military at 18. That had been my focus my entire life. I knew nothing about the private sector. I didn't know the difference between a stock and a bond. I didn't know anything about venture capital or technology. So I had a lot to learn, and I knew that. So I went to Columbia. They have a great program for non-traditional veterans and folks like that to get my undergraduate degree. And because I knew I was going to do this, I focused on computer science, becoming somewhat technical. I banged on as many doors in the business school as I could and took all the classes on venture capital and everything else that they'd let me take. And so I tried to educate myself and get a lay of the land before I actually founded RAVN, which ended up being in 2017. And at the time when I founded it, I was very focused on moving that information that came in over the radio to a visual medium, and effectively building a heads-up display for soldiers, something that they could wear in the field that would present information to them visually, which is far easier to digest and take in. And so I was focused on augmented reality at the time, which is the kind of underlying technology behind like heads-up displays and things like that, at least on the software side. And at that time, this is circa 2017, around 2015, there was a big narrative shift in the DoD where it was all about human machine teaming. So they were planning on fielding thousands of drones, everything from small tactical quadcopters to tracked vehicles and all these things that were going to have varying levels of autonomy. So instead of sending a soldier into a building, you could send a drone, and that drone could clear the building and make it far safer for a soldier to enter. And so we were all kind of expecting this wave of technology to hit the battlefield. And so the natural fit for a heads-up display was to take full motion video feed and other types of telemetry from these tactical systems and present them to warfighters in kind of a dashboard fashion, or a heads-up display through the heads-up display. So that's what our initial focus was on. And in 2017, it was just me and a deck, and I went out and raised some money from kind of angels and friends and family, and slowly built up the team and was able to win a couple of SBIRs, or the SIBRs, the Small Business Innovation Research grants from the DoD. And that's where things started.
We're looking forward to talking about your funding, but can you describe what RAVN's solution looks like?
Sure. So we pivoted away from the heads-up display, of course, and I can talk about that. But our solution now effectively digitizes and automates communication or coordination between warfighters. And it works just as well for soldiers on the battlefield as it does for workers in an office, whether you're an intel person communicating with the operations center or communicating with air traffic control and everything in between. You know, in our civilian lives, we use all sorts of tools, different software tools to coordinate. And I use the word coordinate because it denotes a level of action on either side to achieve a common goal, right? So if I want you to come to my position, I send you a pin on Google Maps. If I want to order food, I use DoorDash. If I want to unlock my door when you arrive, I use a smart lock, right? There are all these different tools, software tools that we use to coordinate. Well, the DoD doesn't really have much like that. Most of the communication and coordination that happens is all over the radio. It's really great to communicate over the radio, which is just exchanging information and ideas. It's really difficult to coordinate over the radio, which is, you know, I've got to send you a location and you've got to do something with that information. And so we have created a system which allows warfighters to take the tasks that they might normally execute over the radio, kind of their coordination tasks, if you will, turn them into automated workflows so they can input who, what, when, where, why to some capacity, and then they can automate certain elements of that. And they can then use those, we call them bolts, B-O-L-T-S. They can use those bolts on whatever device suits their operational environment. So a soldier would use it in a smartwatch. They would be able to, you know, execute a convoy over a smartwatch or call in an airstrike potentially over a smartwatch, communicating with an aircraft. Whereas if you're an intel person or you're in the operations center, you would just use it in a PC interface. And our goal is to support everything in between because we want to support all the different operating environments out there. And so with something like Helios, which is what our product is called, you can coordinate with, you know, your colleagues or your teammates in seconds what would normally take upwards of 5-6 minutes over the radio. So it's a pretty drastic improvement. It's really making that shift from doing something analog to moving it to software. Once you're in software, you can automate things, you can create data, you can do all these fancy things to just make it far more efficient.
I just right now am having all of these examples pop in my head. And I feel like listeners who were in the military are also having these, just like these memories pop in their head. And so mine is 20 years ago when I'm training and learning about medevac, like why is something so important, so difficult? And it sounds like your solution can actually make this much easier.
It does. And most of the calls that come out are all verbatim. They come out the same way every time. And you just drop kind of unique information in at a few points, like your location, you know, the call sign of the casualty, the type of injury, something like that. It's because they're verbatim, they're very easy to turn into these pre-configured little workflows or bolts. And as that's the case, you can go out in the field with a suite of 20 bolts that you would use for 90% of your communication, and you can execute those. And like you said, it can take something that it was really difficult over the radio, where you're trying to pass a location and you're on the side of a mountain and you've got your Write in the Rain notebook and you're trying to write down a 10-digit grid and then send that to somebody else over a different rate. I mean, these things take minutes and they should take seconds, because in software, you can do all that and you can automate all of that. And so we give warfighters the ability to do that. And as a result, the product has been met with pretty strong enthusiasm throughout the DoD.
So how did you, build your team, and how did you get those SIVers?
Sure. So when I mentioned earlier, when I started, it was just me and a deck going around. I was able to raise a little bit of money. Fortunately for me at the time, I had some passive income from a few jobs that I had in New York. So I wasn't drawing a salary, so I could raise a little bit and it would go a long way. When I was at Columbia, I worked in the augmented reality lab, which turns out a number of PhDs every year. And I was able to find a co-founder at the time who joined the team. And together we were able to leverage some technology he had built early on to demonstrate conceptually what we were thinking with our product. We were able to use that to go out and get a couple of SBIRs through the DoD, or at least get those conversations started. They took a year or so to materialize. With that traction with the SBIRs that we were getting, we were able to go out and raise a little bit more money. And then with that a little bit more money, we were able to build a better team. So you have those 3 or 4 different lanes where you've got investor interest, customer interest, potential employee interest, right? And then ultimately product development. And it was push one an inch or two down that one lane, and then the other one an inch or two down that lane, and go back and forth, which was not the ideal way to do it. I think normally in other industries, you're able to just prove a certain amount of traction and then go out and raise a significant round. But because we were building for DoD, there aren't a lot of investors that will just write a $1.5 million check for that industry. And we had to do it incrementally along the way.
You're telling the story, it's the end of 2021, and you're talking about a few years ago. So you make it sound really not seamless, even though you're juggling a lot of things, it sounds really seamless. But can you talk about some of the challenges?
Sure. So we were lucky in that we had, coming out of the SEAL teams, and I had a few other folks on the team that were military. Actually, 3 out of 4 of them were former SEALs, and then one is former Army. We had good inroads, especially in the special operations environment. And that's generally where you want to start for a lot of technologies that are going to hit the battlefield, because they're the early adopters, if you will, in the military. And so it was easy for us to get to users. It was a kind of a next logical step was to get to kind of the future concepts groups out there, which kind of managed the different SBIRs and things like that, or had relationships where they could get you SBIRs with them as the sponsor, if you will. And so we had one of those groups, particularly in Naval Special Warfare, which is the SEAL teams. They pushed us to 2 different groups that got us SBIRs. One was Office of Naval Research, and the other was an Air Force group that was kind of one of the more startup friendly SBIRs that's out there. And so we only had to apply to, we were 2 for 2, I guess, but that's because we had those pre-existing relationships and they paved the way for us. And the application process was wildly different for the two SBIRs. O&R was a lot more geared towards academia. It's a formal. AFWorks is kind of a weird organization. It's almost an intermediary between customers, and then they have the ability to leverage SBIR dollars. They're not beholden to the same standards, or they've rewritten the standards for applying, and they're much more startup friendly. Regardless, it's pretty onerous to apply to these things. Jeff and I were talking. Both of us have applied to SBIRs that were due, in early January, and that effectively erases any break you might take over December. And so that's how we got involved in those. And we had, like I said, we had access to users just from our networks. But what a lot of people don't know is that unless you're under contract, the DoD is really gonna get a lot of heartburn when it comes to talking with you, because there have been things that have happened in the past, and I didn't know this until recently, but there'll be a company that's talking to a random SEAL out there, and he'll say, "Oh yeah, we'll do this and this, and we'll buy this number if you build this," and they'll go out and build it, and then they'll come back and the buyers in the DoD are like, we've never even heard of you before, and we're of course not going to buy millions of dollars worth of this. And then they'll sue the government because a government rep told them that if they built it, they would buy it. And so there's all these rules around who can talk to the DoD. If you're not under contract, they generally don't want users talking with vendors because of false promises and the liability that creates. So there's a lot of barriers to get that information or to get tight feedback loops from customers. And so being on a SBIR or being under contract in some capacity really is necessary for a lot of groups to feel comfortable to bring you in. So other than just the non-dilutive capital that it provides unfettered access to user groups and even buyers as well. So it's pretty critical to get on contract in some capacity, whether it's a SBIR or an OTA or something like that, early on if you're going after the DoD.
So you mentioned that your team is it's all, or at least originally, it was all military. So you had really strong connections with end users, less so buyers, but at least 1 or 2 degrees from there. But were there certain skills, certain kinds of people that you were missing that made it challenging?
Yeah, actually, I glossed over it, but we when we first started, the first 2 years, I was the only vet on the team. We had mostly engineers and designers. It was basically only me, and I was leveraging the relationships that I had. But yeah, absolutely. The most important people on the team are the people that are going to build the product for you. And I had a degree in computer science, but I don't write code. If I'm writing code, something has gone horribly wrong. And so the first person that we brought on was a software engineer who had a PhD in augmented reality. The second person that we brought on was actually at the time let me rewind, but when we started, we thought we were going to be able to leverage an off-the-shelf heads-up display for soldiers. We felt like there was enough money, VC money pouring into the industry, that there would be something out there eventually that would emerge that would be relevant for the battlefield. After exploring a lot and learning what was on most of the company's roadmaps out there, we realized there wasn't anything that was going to be usable by soldiers in the field. So we decided that if we were going to solve this problem, we had to build our own. Of course, neither of us were hardware inclined and had no training in that discipline. And so we found a guy who was widely considered one of the leading experts in the industry through a podcast. And I actually recruited him first as an advisor, then he joined as our chief science officer. And he gave us a lot of credibility to actually go out and build the hardware that we needed to build. So we started there, and then he brought in a guy who had built ruggedized hardware for the Intel community earlier on, and the team scaled from there. But we were probably 7 or 8 before we brought in any additional vets. And you brought something in, or you mentioned something earlier about having access to buyers. We had access to users, but not so much buyers. Initially, we did not have access to buyers, but once we got our feet under us, and this is a couple of years in, we went out and hired a SEAL who had, after his career as a SEAL, which was 11 years, he went and ran a portfolio for naval special warfare. So he actually was one of the DoD buyers. So he brought his Rolodex with him, and he brought, a really in-depth understanding of the monster that is the DoD's acquisition process. And so he's helped us navigate that. But that's been absolutely critical, because without knowledge of how the system actually works, how the bureaucracy actually works, you're just not going to be able to get anywhere.
So it's interesting. So we talked to another company, which in a lot of ways has a lot of parallels to yours, in the sense that what they're building is basically social media analytics to identify extremist behaviors. And the clear first customer for them was the DoD and the U.S. security and institutions. Much like the clear first customer for you was DoD. They made the decision that actually DoD is just too hard of a first customer. It's too long. It requires too much infrastructure, too much effort to go apply. You looked at the same set of challenges and said, regardless, I'm still going to make DoD my first customer. I'm just curious if you have any reflections on DoD as a first customer and how to make that a successful choice.
Sure. So there's a concept out there in the startup world of mercenaries versus missionaries. Mercenaries being people that either have a technology that they're in love with and they've developed and they want to apply to any industry to solve any problem, or they find a market that's growing and they just want to get involved. So they find the pain points and then develop the technology to solve those pain points. Those are the mercenaries. And then they're the missionaries, which, as the name describes, are just on a mission to convert people and are going to do this thing no matter what. I was definitely in the missionary camp. I still am, very much so. It didn't matter how challenging it got. The experiences that I had overseas, the experiences that my friends and teammates are still having to this day overseas, I will never stop going after this particular mission. And so it was never a question for me. I got a lot of pushback on it, and I got a lot of people telling me I should develop the technology in a consumer space or a commercial space first and then make the jump, as many dual use companies do. And that is, for many technologies and for many solutions, a really viable solution, or a viable path, and in fact probably a better path. But some environments in the DoD are so unique that you will never find an analog in the commercial sector. And I think being on the battlefield and getting shot at and actually experiencing those problems, there's nothing else like it. And so if you go out and you want to develop a technology for a different industry, it could be heavy industry, it could be people running around out in the field, could be emergency. There are some overlaps there, but ultimately, I think if you're going to do it, you've got to do it right for this particular environment. And so we felt like there wasn't anything that we could do in the commercial sector that would translate very well to the DoD. And so it was a mix of, my mission was to go after the DoD and to solve problems for people that I cared about. And I also didn't feel like for this particular environment, there was going to be much use in going after a commercial use case. So it wasn't a difficult decision for me. It wasn't really a decision at all. But for most companies going after the DoD, I think it is something you should think long and hard about. And in fact, in my opinion, unless you're serious about going after the DoD, you should probably steer clear, at least in the early stages. Find a commercial industry which you can penetrate and do that and get to sustainability, and then make the jump into the DoD. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can talk about.
So speaking of the differences between the commercial and defense markets, how's it different building product for the DoD?
Yeah, writing software for the DoD is very difficult. And there's a number of reasons that it's difficult. One, to start, many of the program offices or the buyers, they don't even know how to buy software. They have contracting officers which literally will not write contracts for software. They just don't understand it. So, for example, if you're building for a lethality group, that buys, hardware for soldiers. They're used to buying guns and bullets and body armor, night vision goggles. They literally will not be able to purchase software if you want to have a recurring license. It'll be a bridge too far for them, or it'll take them a few years to figure out. And so if you don't have hardware to sell to them, they're not going to be able to buy your product, at least in the time frame that you as an early stage startup need. The other thing is they just have a complete lack of understanding of how much it actually takes to build software. One of our contracts, which is for, I think, like $1.5 to $2 million to turn what is a prototype into a full product. So get through all the encryption implemented, to, go through all the QA to make it deployable by soldiers on the battlefield. $1.5 to $2 million. It's like a penny for what you need to turn something into a production software. It's like a fraction of what you need. And the program office guy, the buyer, looked at us and he goes, "Why are you charging so much? You're just writing an app." And I almost like fell out of my chair at the time. I took a couple of deep breaths. And so they have a fundamental lack of understanding of how to purchase it. They have a fundamental lack of understanding of what is required to actually build it. And then their budgets just are not really aligned to recurring software models. Now, that's some of the buyers, not all the buyers, certainly. If you're lucky enough to get to some of the buyers that do know how to buy software, and you're going to touch a DoD network, you've got to go through very lengthy certification processes, authorities to operate. You've got to have your code tested 6 ways from Sunday, which is all important and is necessary. And there are third-party groups out there which will now help you expedite that. But that can make it very challenging as well. And if you're looking to build software for the DoD, you've got to spend a lot of time up front making sure that you build into your runway. A, do you have the right buyer that can actually buy it? B, do you have the runway to, once you're done with development, get through the ATO process and a lot of the certification process? And then something I didn't mention, the DoD has a very particular architecture which they're looking for to run something on DoD networks. And I don't want to speak incorrectly about it, but you need to talk to the folks that are in the know about what that architecture looks like, to make sure that you've designed it from the ground up to be interoperable with their systems and with their networks. Because if you don't, it's going to take a long time to rewrite that. It's one of those things where you got to get with the right people, tell them what you're building very early on, and validate your assumptions at every step, and then build in the budget to go through very lengthy certification processes on top of finding the right buyer.
So you've touched on some of your private funding. Can you talk a little bit about that journey from the beginning to now, and how it paralleled your SBIR and OTA or other opportunities? And if you were getting conflicting guidance, whether it was a negative or a positive for the VCs you were talking to that you were working with the government?